Okay, so welcome to Abnormal Psychology online. I usually do teach this in person, but because of the coronavirus and everything that's happening now, I'm making this video for you. And also while we're waiting for your textbooks to come in, if it hasn't come in yet. So we start Abnormal Psychology. For those of you who are taking what I usually do in person, is I usually write on the board. It's like I do it, what they call it, chalk and talk. So I write on the board and I explain things, and then you usually ask me questions. So pause if you need to pause whenever, in order to write what I've written on the board, which I'm going to show you here. There we are, Abnormal Psych. And then email me any questions. Okay, so we can also do live sessions. Just email me if you want to do that, and we could try to figure out a live session. But those would be not mandatory. Those would just be for people who want to talk about anything that you're reading. Okay, so Abnormal Psychology, here we are. You have to be very careful. We're going to talk about definition of abnormal. The definition of psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior of humans and animals. So if you're in this class, you've taken Introduction to Psychology. So we're not going to focus on what psychology is. We're going to focus on what abnormal psychology is. So with abnormal, you have to be very, very careful because you're calling someone's behavior abnormal. So this involves sort of three factors that you're looking at. So if you're looking at someone's behavior, does the behavior cause dysfunction? Okay, and you don't need all three, but only one of the following factors that I'm talking about is not going to be sufficient. Okay, so you don't need you don't need all of the factors that we talk about, but you do need a combination because one by itself is not going to do it. Okay, so we have the concept of dysfunction. So the behavior or your thoughts is causing some sort of dysfunction, or it's impeding you or not allowing you to function as highly as you have the potential to function. So this might occur in relationships. So you're going to look at dysfunction in relationships. So were you in a very, very happy relationship and it didn't work out because of something that was happening, something that you were doing that you didn't want to do, the way you were treating someone when you didn't mean to treat them that way, you wish you could stop? So you want to take a look at the relationships. Is it causing problems in relationships? Is it causing problems in employment? Did you lose a job? Are you in danger of losing a job because of the behavior? Okay, so are you losing a job? Are you in danger of losing a job? Are you not able to get the job because of your behavior? Or are you unable to apply for the job because, let's say, you have an unfounded fear that you won't get it? You're so afraid you won't even try, even though trying is just a matter of typing up a resume and sending it by email, right? Are you so afraid that you won't do that? Okay, because that would be dysfunctional, because it could be something that you could get and that you would make your life pretty good. So is it causing problems? Is your behavior or your thoughts causing problems in self-care? So if we think about something like depression, where they just feel like they can't do anything, getting up to take a shower is a real struggle sometimes when someone has depression. Okay, are there things that you want to do for yourself? You want to exercise, but you're so down that you can't bring yourself to do it. And then childcare, for those who are parents or for those of you who are responsible for a little one. Is your behavior preventing you from taking care of this child that you have responsibility for or partial responsibility for? Okay, if that's the case, we really want to help so that we can help you and the child that's involved. All right. Now we can take a look also at distress. So if we're going to say that your behavior is abnormal, we want to see if it causes you distress. Right? So And distress, this could be to yourself or to others. So obviously, if it's causing you distress, if it's making you feel pain, we want to help with that. We want to help alleviate that. Maybe you're functioning fine, but you come home and you just are in tremendous psychological pain. We would want to stop that before you take some sort of action to relieve the pain that might not be healthy. Also, some people, as you know, they don't necessarily feel the psychological pain as much as they inflict it. So if you're causing a lot of psychological pain or a lot of physical pain to someone else, we also want to fix that. We also want to remedy that. Okay, so it's not just yourself, it's others too. If there are children involved, if a significant other comes in and is trying to help, it might not feel good at first, but I think what they're saying is that you or someone else is inflicting a lot of pain. Okay? We're also going to look at impairment, right? So impairment's also similar to dysfunction. You're impaired, like impaired driving ability. It's just not fully what it could be. Okay. And then there's also not culturally expected, right? So not culturally expected. So for this, you also have to look at the other person's culture. So if they're telling you, I had a dream that not a dream, but my dead relative came back to me one more time and then he was gone, but he was really sitting in my room and then he left. If they're saying that close to the time of death, that might be culturally acceptable for their culture. So that's why psychologists really should do some cross-cultural classes, some cross-cultural training, so that they know what's expected in another culture and they don't just mark it as abnormal because it's not in American or Western European culture. Right? So we look at other cultures too, see what's going on there. So not culturally expected. Also, our cultures change too. American culture changes too. In 1994, before 1994, homosexuality was in the DSM-5. The DSM, at that point, it would have been the DSM-4. So the DSM is the standard manual of psychological disorders. So prior to 1994, it got taken out in 1994, but prior to 1994, homosexuality, I believe, was in there. And now, obviously, the culture has changed, so that would not be considered abnormal, according to the DSM. Which brings me to the DSM. Right? With culturally unexpected, I also want to add it's going to be statistically unexpected too. A lot of the disorders we're going to talk about this semester are going to be found in less than 2% of people. So that's statistically unexpected, right? If it's 2%, you have a 98% chance of not having it. So it's pretty much overwhelming chances. But, 2%, many of the disorders, again, will only have like a 2% rate. It'll be in only 2% of the population. But again, statistical rareness is not going to be enough by itself to call it abnormal, because a genius is also not statistically expected. By definition, is going to be the top. I believe 2% for giftedness. And that's not going to be considered abnormal. So you have to take all of those things, the dysfunction, the impairment, the distress, the cultural unexpectedness, and the statistical unexpectedness. And then those are the types of things that we're going to talk about this semester. Okay, DSM-5. This is our book that I'm getting a lot of this information from. You could buy it for yourself. It's at Barnes & Noble. Or probably Amazon too. It runs about $100. But I would say don't, when you buy it, you really have to read it very carefully with somebody else's guidance who has experience, because otherwise you'll be diagnosing yourself and your family members and you really think you'll have this stuff when you don't. Like, you really need to see the examples of what they're talking about. Sometimes the definition itself does not give you the full picture. It's kind of like reading your own x-ray. Like, you'll think you're dying and you're not, like, it's normal. So that's just a caveat. If you have any questions you decide to bite yourself, just ask me. So the DSM-5, here we are. This is the book. So what does DSM-5 stand for? And they use Roman numeral 5 there. D is for diagnostic. So that means that it's all the diagnoses that we currently recognize, or that the APA, which in this case is the American Psychiatric Association, but the other APA, the American Psychological Association, we use it too. So it's the disorders that we recognize, and it has all of the disorders in there plus all the symptoms. Right? So it's used as a diagnostic tool. We use it to diagnose those disorders. So it's diagnostic and statistical. So like I said, usually it's going to be less than 2%. And sometimes they revise the DSM, but the statistics change a little bit. The statistical section is not a different section. They'll just give you statistical background on each disorder. It's grouped by disorder. So they'll give you the background, they'll give you the description, they'll give you the symptoms, and then they'll give you a sense of like how many males have it, how many females have it, how many people in the population have it, what's the age group that has it, what's the average age it appears, etc., etc. It might give you, if it goes into remission, what the prognosis is. So there's some disorders, the prognoses, where like 10 years later, 50% do not have it anymore. And then there's some diagnoses where it's usually lifelong. So that's the kind of information that you would get in the DSM, the statistical paragraph or section of the particular disorder. So M is for manual, because it's a book. I guess you could get an online version of it and like read it on your Kindle or whatever. So it's a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. Okay. I don't really recommend getting it at this point. If you go into this beyond this class, you might have to get it. But we will be going through, and you have, almost all the abnormal psychology textbooks have the excerpt of the symptoms describing each disorder. So you'll have what you need from it in any typical abnormal psychology textbook. 5 is for 5th edition, right? This particular 5th edition came out in 2013. Okay, and it's published by the APA, and as I mentioned before, the APA in this case is the American Psychiatric Association. So those are the people, or that's the group, the organization that publishes this. There is an APA, which is the American Psychological Association, and they're separate, but the APA, the American Psychological Association, they do use it as well. Okay, so it's in use by both APAs. All right, so there's your DSM. All right, in this class, we are going to talk about etiologies. Etiology. So etiology is just a very fancy word for cause. Okay, so etiology is a very fancy word for cause. So what is the etiology of schizophrenia? This is a fancy way of saying what causes schizophrenia. So, or if you want to say, what are the etiological, if you want to write a paper, the etiological factors of schizophreniform disorder. That's just basically saying, well, what are the causal factors? Right, so there's a lot of research. Because when you try to find the cause, if you find the cause, then you could find a remedy, and you can also find prevention strategies. So that's why we're very, very focused in this class on etiological factors. A lot of good research being done on all of these, well, some more than others, but a lot of good research being done. Okay. So I'll just give you some examples of etiological causes that we're going to be looking at through the semester. So we're going to say, we're going to look at, environmental. Does the environment cause this? Does abuse cause it? Does intense physical abuse as a child, does that cause it? So that would be an environmental etiological factor. Now, part of the mystery of this is that there are people who go through intense psychological and physical abuse as a child, and they come out okay. They come out very kind, very highly functional, because of what they went through. So I don't want you to feel like if you've gone through this, like it's any kind of indication of your fate that you can't escape that. It's certainly understandable if an experience like that sort of makes you very angry and would lead to dysfunctional behavior. But we also find that there are people who have, some type of resiliency that, like, no matter how horrible their past, they somehow keep bouncing back. And that's amazing. But we also know that, when anger is inflicted on someone, that anger is likely to go somewhere else. Right? So if you inflict anger on someone, that person might inflict that anger, that energy towards someone else. So, anyway, this is all a discussion of environmental etiological factors. And again, just like with the definition of abnormal, one thing by itself is not really going to do it. Most of these things are going to be caused by a combination of these etiological factors, or these causal factors. What do I have next? Oh, genetics. Okay, so genetics. And a lot of people have said to me over the past, 23 years of teaching, and I don't know how many, 20 years maybe, years being a psychologist. My parents have this. My dad's an alcoholic, I'm going to be an alcoholic. And it's true. They have a lot of genetic, there's a lot of research on genetics showing that the possibility is higher. You have a higher possibility, but it's always a possibility. It's never 100%. Even if you have a monozygotic twin or an identical twin with something, you don't have 100% chance of getting what they have because you are a different person. Even if you have 100% of the genetic information, you're still a separate person. So your chances are, it's never 100%. Never. Right? Even in that case where all the genetic information is shared. So keep that in mind. It's going to always be a combination of environment, genetics, and other things as well. Okay? So there is a portion of it that's going to be under your control. So don't ever think that efforts that you make are useless. Every time you might not feel it, but every time you try to approach something changes slightly. Okay? So something changes slightly, and you're getting toward your goal, even though you might not feel it. Okay, so I just want to keep that in mind. But again, a lot of great research being done in genetics. But always keep in mind, even if like everyone in your family you think is cuckoo, it does not mean that you're going to have anything necessarily. You can always do things to manage or to prevent. Okay, so thought patterns. We love this in psych. So thought patterns. We know that thought patterns do cause problems. So someone does not show up for something that they clearly could have succeeded in because they talked themselves out of it. And again, not applying for something, even though you could. They're so scared of rejection that they'd rather not try. That's not really, it's not functional. It's not good for you. So watch for those thought patterns. People are deathly afraid of being alone because they're scared of their own thoughts. Right? If you love your own thoughts, you'd be happy to be alone. Right? Completely happy to be alone. If you have terrible thoughts like, I'm nothing, I need somebody, I have no identity, my life is useless, well, of course, you're not going to want to be alone. You're going to be terrified of being alone. And most of us find us alone at some point in our lives. right? So we're going to have to change those thoughts to help you get you through that period. And we know that changing thoughts also changes your brain chemistry, right? So there have been studies on that. Here we go to brain chemistry. Neurotransmitters. Okay, so these are things you might have learned about in Intro to Psychology, like serotonin and dopamine and acetylcholine, and GABA, endorphins, right? So these are your neurotransmitters. So sometimes they believe, or they have measured, that there's different levels of neurotransmitters that are associated with different disorders. Okay, neurotransmitters are the chemical messages that get sent between the neurons. That's why they're called neurotransmitters. Okay, and neurons are they're cells. If you remember from Intro, you probably you drew your soma and your axon and your dendrites, and your axon terminals or terminal buttons. So if you remember that, then you have it in your background. But if you don't remember it, that's okay. We're gonna talk about it, and also we're gonna read about it. All right. So, and also supernatural, right? There's supernatural causes to the disorders, right? So the supernatural causes to the disorders. And we're actually going to go from there, because a lot of most textbooks will start with the supernatural causes when they're talking about the history, because now we're going to go into the history of abnormal psych. All right, so you've got supernatural causes, right? So supernatural, so is it let's take an extreme, is it demon possession, right? So hundreds of years ago. Even now you'll see cases where people will say it's demon possession. It's not really something the APA, current psychologists really look at, demon possession, but some cultures do believe in that. If you believe in demon possession, RX is for remedy, right? You've seen this at your pharmacy maybe. So the remedy would be exorcism, right? So that's extreme. That's extreme, and that was happening, hundreds, thousands of years ago. Now, I don't want to, ridicule that in any way, because some people do believe that there are still supernatural causes, so some people might think, and I'm partial to this, that it could be a spiritual issue, right? You could be depressed because, you don't know what's going to happen after you die, right? You don't know what the meaning of life is. You don't know what the purpose of life is. So you're kind of in this just depressed state, right? Could be a depressed state of emergency, right? And so sometimes you do have to get into the spiritual, right? You sometimes reach that point where there's nothing left and you've hit rock bottom. So what will help, right? And so some people, do go instead, go to pastors and clergy. And psychologists who have spiritual leanings can do this work too, right? So this is still here. Now, biological. Okay, so if you have biological factors, right, that are causing the disorder, then you're going to have a biological treatment, right? So let's take an extreme biological treatment. So a remedy could be bleeding. If they think your instability of mood is caused by too much blood, then they put leeches on you and bleed you. This hasn't been done for a long time, hundreds of years at least. So I don't know. I don't want to say 150 years. So it's bleeding, right? They'll bleed you. Not great, right? And now we don't really do that. We do medications. But medication's very, very interesting. If I always encourage you, if you're put on a new medication, really watch. Some of these medications a little bit more experimental than you think. So definitely take a look at what you're being put on. and do some of the research on your own. Okay, if we think there's a cognitive issue, if you remember from Intro to Psych, and if not, I'll just tell you now, the cognitive issue is a thinking issue, like we were talking about before, the thought patterns. Do you have a depressive thought pattern? Right? Or do you have a paranoid thought pattern? You think everything someone says to you is an insult and a way to undermine you, right? We'd have to change that so that you don't end up starting fights with everybody, right? So cognitive. And certainly if you're depressed, we would want to help someone who's depressed, right? So the remedy is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which you also might have heard of in Intro. Again, if you haven't, we are going to read about it. All you're going to need will be here in the next 8 weeks. Okay, so cognitive behavioral therapy, that's more what we look at now. Okay, so that brings us, again, we're talking about the history of abnormal psychology, taking a look at, the 1890s, the heavy influence, and onward. I don't even have an end date because you can still find his books all over the place. Sigmund Freud. Okay, most of you have heard of him. When I ask this of classes in person, they'll usually say cocaine addict and some negative things about Sigmund Freud, but there's a lot to the theory that's actually very much still with us and can help us to understand ourselves and other people. That said, I'm not a psychoanalytic psychologist, but I believe there's something there. So psychoanalytic theory is Freud's theory, right? So psychoanalytic theory, one of the very important things about psychoanalytic theory is it brought to us the idea of the unconscious. I think I probably wiped out the C with my thumb or something. So unconscious, UNCONSCIOUS. Okay, so these are things that you're not conscious of. It's outside of awareness. So what Freud is saying, there's a lot of things that you do, a lot of things that you think you're attracted to someone because of one reason, but it's really not the real reason. Most of what drives us is unconscious. The conscious part of us, the part that we think we are, is very tiny. And the vast majority of what drives us, according to Freud, are things that we're not aware of. We buried those things a long time ago in the deep recesses of our brains, of our minds. Right? So how do you get there then? Because we don't want to be functioning and not know why we're functioning and then suddenly make a huge mistake and then wonder what happened. Freud's going to say, well, it's going to be through therapy, through many years of analytic therapy. It used to be, and some people still do this, is 3 times a week, sometimes 5 times a week. But working with insurance, they're going to want 1 time a week. So you have to figure out how you're going to do that if you're going to work with insurance. But it's deep and intensive, and you're going to talk a lot about your childhood. Okay, so other ways of getting to that is, through dreams. Your dreams are also a path to your unconscious, right? So write down your dreams when you wake up. If you don't have any dreams, I would suggest maybe waking up without an alarm clock, because usually most of us wake up to an alarm clock and then we're immediately busy and the dream is gone. We're immediately angry and the dream is just gone. Also, you're going to be taking a look at Freudian slips, which are things that these are slips of the tongue, right? You accidentally say something. You're like, whoops. So for example, accidentally calling one person by another person's name could get you in a whole lot of trouble. And if you say, no, I didn't mean it, Freud would say, yes, you did. Right? You meant it. So think about it. Also, there's a belief, okay, within this theory that there are no accidents. There are no accidents. You meant to do that. So they'll take a look at accidents, things that happen, when you accidentally did something. You think you innocently did it, and they'll say, no, you didn't. There's something about that. And also lateness. Right? They'll look at lateness. Why are you late all the time? You really don't want to be here. Right? And then we also have defense mechanisms. Okay, so defense mechanisms. That's also brought to us by Freud. These are amazing, actually. So defense mechanisms like denial. Things that we do, it's just kind of like mental gymnastics that we do to prevent ourselves from harm. We're actually defending ourselves because there's a lot of pain in this world that we don't want to deal with. We're going to defend ourselves from feelings of inferiority. So denial, an example of denial would be something like, I'm not jealous of the person who has everything I dreamed for. They have everything I wanted. But I'm not jealous. Right? I'm not bitter in any way. I'm really happy for them. Right? So again, that's some of Freud. We could probably go for weeks and weeks and weeks on Freud. So all right. And then lastly, not lastly, but just for today, we're going to be doing, there were some people who didn't believe in this at all. They didn't believe in the unconscious. They didn't think that Freudian theory was particularly scientific. They thought, well, you can't prove any of this. You can't prove anything has been denied. I'm just looking for my marker, but I can't seem to find it. So there are people who decided that's not what psychology should be about. Psychology should be about the behavioral model. Okay, so the behavioral model. One of these people who really did not believe in Freud and was very, I would go ahead and say annoyed as a light word for what he felt about Freud's theory, was John Watson. Okay, and in 1920, John Watson put out a paper with, I think his then 20-year-old research assistant, Rosalie Rayner. They ended up getting married. But they put out a paper called Conditioned Emotional Responses, and it's in the library. You can get it. It's in our library. And it was on little Albert, not his real name, but it was a 9-month-old baby of a friend. And what they thought psychology should be about is something more scientific. So Pavlov. Now, when Pavlov did his work, he did his work on salivation, right? And dogs learning to salivate to a bell. He was initially interested in salivation, but he kind of accidentally found, or he noticed that the dogs were salivating to the lab assistant. And so he decided, let me study this, because there seems to be an association that's forming between the lab assistant and the dogs. The dogs are forming an association between the lab assistant and salivation. So he studied that, and that's where we got the unconditioned stimulus leading to the unconditioned response. And then if it's paired enough times with the conditioned stimulus, or just one time, if it's really extreme, it could just take one pairing. So if you pair this, the conditioned stimulus will then elicit the conditioned response. So if you remember with Ivan Pavlov, right, you had the food leading to the salivation being paired with the bell or the tone repeatedly, and then eventually the dogs were conditioned to respond, right? They had a conditioned response to the bell. So they were salivating to the bell. So John Watson thought that they should study this, right? So John Watson felt like this should be the way we study phobias in psychology. And so how he did this, he worked backwards. He said, I want to study fear, because before that, Freud had published a book called The Sexual Enlightenment of Children, where he talked about a horse phobia in a 3-year-old boy named Hans. And so he said, I'm going to take a 9-month-old boy to show you that this happens without any kind of, prior experience. That's very, very a clean slate. SSA. And so he's interested in fear. How does fear develop in a 9-month-old? So what he decides is he wants to teach a little boy, a 9-month-old boy, to fear a white rat. So he's kind of working backwards. So if you want to teach a little boy to fear a white rat, you have to pair the white rat with something that they're already afraid of. Okay, so that white rat will be paired with, and sometimes I ask, what are little kids already afraid of? And my students over the years have said things like clowns, but it's kind of expensive to pay a clown to scare someone. And someone said darkness, which is pretty good too. They chose a really loud noise, which was created by banging 2 steel bars behind little Albert's head. And there's a YouTube video of little Albert you can watch. So if they pair the white rat with the 2 steel bars, right? The 2 steel bars being banged behind his head. They didn't hit him, but it was like behind his head so that he was scared, right? So that's the unconditioned response. Unconditioned in that you don't have to learn how to fear a loud noise. You're born fearing a loud noise, right? But when they paired that white rat with the loud noise over and over and over a period of months, he became afraid of that white rat. Okay, so these are the kinds of relationships we also look at. We talk about phobia. We talk about, other maladaptive, some maladaptive feelings. Maybe it is a connection or an association, a fear that you had something happened when you were younger, and now you think that this new situation is going to cause that because it has some similarities, right? So, anyway, that's me trying to explain to you some of the concepts, while we're waiting for our books, and, while we can't meet, we've had to move on to a completely online platform. So if you have any questions, just email me. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you or hearing from you, some other way. Okay, bye. Pause.